Has the government been scamming estate workers out of their own homes? Welcome to Cili Selasa, where we talk about issue semasa with me, your host Iqbal, and today I want to talk about an ongoing issue you might have missed.
And after this, subsequently, they're still giving press news, and every time news they say that okay, they're going to demolish it, and we got no choice to defend the place whereby, in fact, I was born, and I lived for more than half a century, and we wanted to protest, and we protested for 3 days to say that the nightmares that we go through the last 3 days, the amount of agony, the torture that we went.
Yeah, that's rough. Imagine being kicked out of the only home you've ever known, not because you broke the law or did anything wrong, but because someone else wanted the land. That would be like buying a PlayStation after months of saving up for it, only for your mom to give it away to your 10-year-old cousin who wanted it because you're too old for games. No, mom. No, I'm not. And even if I was, that's not the point! Now, this issue blew up in August of this year after estate workers marched to Parliament to hand policymakers a draft law that would guarantee plantation workers permanent housing after they retire. The march ended up being pretty dramatic. Police tried to block the group at the gates of Parliament, and Arul, the deputy chairman of PSM, who was one of the people at the front of the protest, was apparently pushed and later arrested for allegedly deterring public servants from discharging their duty, which, to be clear, is one hell of a way to treat someone else fighting for someone else's right to housing. Oh, you want a home? Nah, have a jail cell. And the thing is, this isn't the first time estate workers have protested in front of Parliament for their right to housing. A few years ago, in December 2019, a group of 200 workers from across the country already marched on Parliament to ask MPs for the same thing, so clearly this is an ongoing issue. Now, I'm guessing from some of you hearing this, you might be thinking, well, rent is ridiculous, houses are too expensive, no one can afford to buy a home, what makes estate workers so special? So, to help you understand what this topic is about, today we're going to talk about why these workers are still facing eviction 150 years after the first rubber tree was planted in Malaysia, how the system that was built to keep them there, and what, if anything, can be done to fix this mess. Starting with what's happening now. To understand this issue, we'll have to step back about 5 decades ago when our Prime Minister at the time, Tunku Abdul Razak, ruled out what was called the Workers' Own Housing Scheme. Under it, estate and mining companies had to set aside a portion of their land to build houses for their workers, which the workers would pay for through monthly salary deductions. The government even set aside a 10 million ringgit special fund under the third Malaysia plan to get it rolling, and at first there were a few projects in like Kedah, Perak and Selangor that was kick-started using that fund, but after that the states started pushing their workers into taking bank loans instead. This made a bunch of people start asking what happened to all that cash, because in reality, that scheme barely made a dent. Out of the roughly 1,000 estates in Peninsular Malaysia at the time, at most, only 33 actually ended up with any workers getting houses, which at a 3% passing rate. If this was an SPM paper, you'd get a better grade if you just tembak the answers to all the questions. Despite that, many of these estates started growing entire communities alongside the crops that they were planting. Many of them had rows of quarters for families, plots of land to grow vegetables, livestock, temples, schools, and even toy shops if you wanted to crack open the cold one with the boys. In fact, some estates were so self-contained that families could go their entire lives without ever leaving them, which, to be fair, it's kind of like being a subangai. You could be born in SJMC, go to school all the way up to any one of the universities they have there, work your whole life in any one of the office buildings right next to Subang Parade, and then retire in any one of the private retirement homes run by Sunway, then die and have your ashes scattered over the lake in Subang Ria Recreational Park. The point is, if you've lived your whole life in a place, leaving it could be unimaginable. But that's exactly what happened to workers living on rubber and palm estates around the Klang Valley, whose plantations were more valuable as developments. So over the years, between the 80s to the 2000s, thousands of estate workers were evicted from their homes so that redevelopment could happen. And here's where the human cost really kicks in. When you boot out people whose entire skill set is tied to working on plantations, you've essentially created a whole new class of urban poor. Most of these guys aren't going to be able to waltz into city jobs after years of working on farms, so how are they supposed to survive? Which brings us to the next question: where was the government in all of this? Well, they did notice what was going on, but their responses were kind of meh. For example, in 1991, the Selangor state government tried to encourage estate owners to build permanent housing for displaced workers, but But the policy was not mandatory, so companies obviously just shrugged it off. And while permanent housing was supposed to be the obvious fix, some cases ended up with workers being moved into so-called temporary housing while waiting for their real homes to be built, which you might think that sounds like a fair compromise, but really it was just a cop-out. Take what happened in Taman Rimba Kiara a decade prior, for instance. In 1982, estate workers from Bukit Kiara were relocated after the government bought over their land. They were then placed in longhouses under the promise that it was only going to be temporary. But 43 years later, 98 families are still there, as shared by this guy who spoke to BFM.
I don't know how to say. We feel like malu like that. See, when we have a Deepavali time, want to invite my schoolmates for a Deepavali event or whatever, so I'll feel like malu that I say, I'm staying in here, I can't accommodate the entire class in this room, so I cannot do any functions. We are not like pendatang haram like that.
Yeah, that's awful. Imagine accepting moving into a place because the government promised it'd be temporary, only to still be there 4 decades later. They'll be like getting stood up on a date and still waiting at the restaurant 43 years later with your date still insisting they're just stuck in traffic. At a certain point, you really have to start admitting to yourself, no, they're not, man. No, they're really not. Meanwhile, while all of this was happening to estate workers, the companies they were working for were cashing in big time. For example, in a 1997 report about forced evictions and housing rights abuses, it mentioned how plantation company KLK Berhad sold their estate in Tanjung Malim to the government for 321 million ringgit. At the time, there were 136 workers living on the estate who were terminated by the company as a result of the land sale, and in total, KLK spent just 900,000 ringgit in termination benefits for the workers, while their total profit from the sale was just over 310 million ringgit. In case you're not doing the math, 900,000 divided by the amount of workers was just about 6,600 ringgit per worker, which is just about 12,000 ringgit in today's money. Imagine your whole life, your home, your memories, your childhood, all taken away from you by the company you worked for your whole life for just 4 months of a fresh grad salary. While in that same year, the company made over 500 million ringgit in profits. Like, fine, they weren't breaking any laws. The houses and land technically never belonged to the workers, and the company had every right to sell it. But that's the problem. You can be doing something entirely legal, but still be a piece of shit for doing it. Like moving your monopoly hotels right in front of the other players every turn. Yeah, it's not against the rules, but screw you for doing it. And what happened at KLK's estate wasn't an isolated incident either. Take this 2003 legal case involving Guthrie. The case involving workers who had been laid off when the company decided to switch from rubber to palm oil, and as a result, thousands of former Guthrie estate workers were asked to leave their homes, which they lived in for multiple generations. In exchange, Guthrie offered them 20 days of salary for each year of service, meaning a worker who'd been with the company for 30 years would get just about 10,000 ringgit. So when the workers tried asking for better compensation, Guthrie said no, and when workers refused to vacate their homes, the company filed eviction proceedings against them. At one point, one of the appeals court judges even asked Guthrie's lawyers, so where are they supposed to go? Are they to go live on trees? Which, whoever that judge was, I hope they're having a retirement that's as happy and comfortable as what it looks like living in one of the retirement homes run by Sunway. Because you also need to understand, these workers weren't even expecting to get their houses for free. Under the housing scheme that Tun Razak set up, part of their monthly salaries were supposed to go towards paying for homes that the companies were meant to build for them. And if that plan had actually worked, many of them would have gotten their own homes fair and square by now. Which brings us to what's being done to solve these issues. And by the way, if you want an easy way to keep up with current issues, you guys should go check out The Coffee Break. It's a free daily newsletter that sums up the biggest local and global stories in under 5 minutes. You can sign up using our code CILISOS, that's CILISOS, to help them and us keep more Malaysians informed. But going back to our story, for a while, estate workers had the National Union of Plantation Workers, which was the largest trade union in the country and one of the largest in Asia. But when estates started switching from rubber to palm oil, they suddenly needed far fewer workers and membership of the union just collapsed. After that, another group, the People's Service Organization, came onto the scene to begin educating workers about their housing rights and push estates to improve basic living conditions. But if there was one group that's made themselves synonymous with fighting for estate workers, it would probably be Parti Socialist Malaysia, or PSM, who so much so have even been called the Parti India Estate, which in hindsight is a really weird way to insult somebody. Like, it'll be making fun of someone for being a good person. Oh, you volunteered taking care of the poor? You fucking loser. But in any case, PSM's been at this for decades. For example, in 1991, they launched a nationwide signature campaign demanding that estate workers be included in the government rural development plans rather than left to the mercy of private companies. And that push worked. The government later required small smaller plantations to be included in the ministry's plans, and that same year, the Selangor state government also introduced a housing policy to protect displaced estate workers. Later in 1996, PSM kicked off another national campaign to raise the minimum wage at a time when estate workers were still paid by each day they worked. Again, this brought results. Estate workers pretty much started receiving monthly minimum wages decades before the minimum wage order was set in 2013. More recently, PSM's been working with another group called Jawatan Kuasa Sokongan Masyarakat Ladang, or JSML, to push back against evictions and campaign for permanent housing rights, which is where we are today when PSM and JSML led estate workers and their allies on a march to Parliament carrying their own solution.
Tempat yang sama Parlimen untuk menyerahkan satu tuntutan untuk kerajaan mendraft akta skim perumahan untuk pekerja ladang.
See, over the past couple of years, JSML had been consulting workers from over 100 estates to come up with their proposed Estate Workers Housing Scheme Act, which, if you're not following, drafting acts is the whole thing a government should be doing. But instead, JSML did their homework for them by gathering stories, drafting clauses, and knocking on doors of state governments and ministries all over to try and push this bill into law. Very briefly, the gist of the bill would mean estate workers must set aside land and build houses with basic amenities. Long-serving Malaysian workers will be allowed to buy their houses at a fixed price of 48,000 ringgit. Workers will be able to pay in installments capped at 300 ringgit a month, and a new estate housing board would keep everyone in check while any disputes will go through a tribunal. Problem is, as usual, things in Malaysia are never straightforward. For one, land is a state matter, meaning even if Parliament passes a national law forcing estate owners to build houses, the federal government would need state governments to pass the same rules. Then there's the issue of cost. As Aro from PSM pointed out, estate companies would not want to pay more than they have to, just like the way we saw them drag workers through court cases that stretched on for years just to avoid paying what they owe. Then, not to mention, the manufacturing sector has warned that stricter housing standards would eat into employers' profits, while developers are always complaining that affordable housing would cut their margins by half. But really, is that surprising? Because honestly, when has any business ever happily agreed to spend more just because the government told them to? So, all in all, between state politics, corporate stinginess, and the usual red tape, it's not that the law can't work. It's just that too many people with power don't really have any reason to make it work. And while we don't know how things will eventually turn out for estate workers who've been sidelined for decades, what we do know is this issue has gone on for too long for us to keep ignoring it anymore. Because at some point, it's not just about blaming companies or politicians, it's about us deciding that people who've spent their whole lives keeping this country running deserve better than to be thrown out when they're no longer useful. What that means is we can start by paying attention when these stories come up, by asking our representatives what they're doing about it, by calling out the hypocrisy when government-linked companies do the evicting, and by remembering that housing should be something that all of us have a right to. Because if someone from Subang can be born, study, work, fall in love, and die all within a 10-kilometer radius of SS15, then just maybe the people who helped build the country deserve the same stability too.